And now, part 2 of chapter 35 of The Last Boy on Earth, The True Battlefield. Because the bridge stood in the river, the power that surged from the dead through Kaylee, a frightful dark energy from another world, began to power the machinery of the transmitter. Kaylee was the conduit, the pathway from the world of the dead back to the world of the living. On the bridge, the lights began to glow with growing intensity. On the observation deck, Joe and Dr. Grindle saw the power lights on the transmitter suddenly turn on. God bless her, thought Joe. I don't know how, but she's done it. He worked feverishly to transmit their message. Later, he would explain to Kaylee that the wattage was off the meter and that equipment that should not have been able to tolerate such energy stood its ground and continued to function. He did not know how much power went through their equipment that night, but there's no doubt that this was the most powerful radio message ever sent in the history of the world, and in far-off places, small groups of humans heard a voice in the night. In times to come, they would talk about that night, and they would discover that every radio on Earth turned on at that moment, each of its own accord. Their broadcast was heard in every language ever spoken over and over again in 1 billion radios, translated by the filter of the dead. This is Civilization Radio. We're broadcasting from Bucksport, Maine, in the United States of America. If you're hearing this, you're not alone. Joe and Dr. Grindle repeated their message along with specific coordinates and almost immediately began receiving broadcasts from small groups of humans from all over the globe. What Joe would later claim was unusual at best. He would explain that each transmission they received was as strong as the transmission they were broadcasting. This was, of course, impossible. Within moments, Joe and Dr. Grindle had personally spoken with over 20 groups of people in North America alone. More messages kept arriving as the power from the water continued to flow into the instruments. The lights on the bridge burned brightly, and from their vantage point at the top of the tower, Joe and Dr. Grindle watched the statue of General Joshua Chamberlain and the tough little gargoyle continue to lay into the monstrous form of Brady Grendel on the river's edge below. The monster drew back when he saw the lights begin to burn fiercely on the bridge. How was that possible? Hadn't he destroyed their generators? They were transmitting. But how? He could hear it in his mind. No, it failed. Again. No, it couldn't be happening, but they'd done it. They'd made contact. All the rage and ruin of the world mounted upon his shoulders, and he flexed his mind towards the river, just as he threw his body onto the form of the determined metal man who slashed and hacked at him with his sword. No, he screamed, and from somewhere deep within him, Brady Grendel felt a twinge that he had never felt before. What was that? A cutting of some thread that held him together, and it severed, it would become his unraveling? As he attempted to pay attention to such a myriad of enemies and ideas, Brady Grendel felt his strength begin to waver. And deep inside the maelstrom of Brady's fear, he continued to fight with Grendel, unaware of the world outside. He countered the monster's blows and offered his own in return, 1,000 strikes in one, tumbling as they fell. It was clear to Brady that they were equally matched. This fight might last an eternity. "Brady," called the book from his back pants pocket, "close your eyes. I can hear her. She's calling to you." And Brady closed his eyes. And there was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen in his life standing next to him, just underneath his eyelids. Her own eyes were filled with sadness, and what was that? Love? She had long black hair that fell over her white-skinned cheeks so that it framed her deep blue eyes, and she wore a dress of silver blue so pure it was almost painful to view. Brady was transfixed. "Brady, do you know me?" she asked. "Kaylee?" he answered. "How can that be? You're older, you're different." "This is how I appear, my form in this world." "Listen, we don't have much time. You have to listen to me. Do you understand?" He smiled and nodded. She was so beautiful that she erased all the ugliness he had seen since the abandonment, the death, and the loss of the world. Simply standing next to her cleansed his mind and soul. "You need to stop fighting. You need to stop resisting. I know what needs to be done." She smiled and tilted her head slightly to the left, her hand cradling his chin. He smiled, not truly understanding how near death he truly was. "What do I have to do?" he asked. "You imagined him into the world, and once he was there, you couldn't do anything to stop him, but now you're with him in your world. All you have to do is unimagine him." "I don't understand," he said. She answered, "Don't you? The multiverse runs on imagination. It's a natural force like gravity. It's an energy field. Remember the laws of physics, like energy, it's never lost or destroyed. If all of a sudden billions die, the power of their imaginations is left to those who survive, and to you in particular. You created him out of your imagination because you were a child when you woke up to the abandonment. You needed someone to blame. That's what children do. Blame someone even if it's not their fault. Since you had no one to blame, your imagination made someone, Grendel. If you let go of your need for blame, he'll weaken and fade away. Stop blaming, Brady. You need to grow up. You're not a kid anymore. You're a man now. Grow up. Be a man. Stand tall. Be brave." He heard it, and he said it in 100 different ways, but when Kaylee said it to him, he finally understood. He wanted it now more than ever. He looked into her eyes and found himself nearly lost within them. How could this girl be the one who saved him in the hospital, so unkempt and severe, the goddess Athena he'd called her? Here in this place, she was so beautiful, so calming and knowing, ageless and timeless, and yet she was his friend, and he knew that she was right. She was his best friend. "I get it," he said, and opened his eyes. He was no longer falling, grappling with the beast. They were near a riverbank in the country, the sunlight shining down upon them through the dancing green of the shimmering leaves above. Brady saw the form of a young boy, about 2 years younger than himself, sitting on the riverbank on a pile of field stones, throwing pebbles into a babbling brook. He looked over his shoulder as Brady approached. All was tranquil. "I'm sorry," said Grendel, in a child's sorrow-filled voice. "I know," said Brady, as he sat down next to him. "I'm sorry, too. It must have been awful. It was all my fault." The child Grendel nodded his head and then looked back toward the river, throwing another stone. Brady put his hand on Grendel's shoulders. The boy leaned into him very slightly, like a trusting little brother. For a few minutes, they just sat there, watching the river run. "I'm going to set you free," Brady said as a light breeze blew through his hair. He knew this place was also inside of his mind because he recognized it as his special place, the space he had created in his mind to forget about things. He had first constructed it on the day his father died, complete with a cool breeze, flowing water, and light dancing through high birch leaves overhead. The smell of freshly mown hay permeated the air. He'd almost forgotten it. "You look just like me," the child Grendel said. "You too," Brady answered. "I'm scared," said the child Grendel. "What are you going to do?" Brady put his hand on the shoulder of his younger self and patted him on the back. "Well, first, I'm going to tell you that I'm sorry for calling you into this world. And then, I'm going to let you go." The child turned his head and looked Brady in the eye and smiled. "Really? I can go?" he asked uncertainly, a promise of happiness on the edge of his smile. "Tell me where you want to go, and I'll imagine it for you. Go anywhere you like." The boy smiled and thought for a long time, and then he took a big flat stone and whipped it across the water as hard as he could, and he nearly made it to the middle of the stream. And then he said, "I know where. I want to go home, to the day before Dad's accident. Except I don't want him to go hunting. I want him to stay home and live so I can grow up and be a family with them together, and he can watch me grow up and he can teach me, and then when he's really old he can pass away in his sleep, and I can become a good man." Brady understood, and his heart flooded with grief and relief all at once. Of course. This was his dearest private wish. Of course, the child, who was really Brady, would want to go to a place where things worked out, where fathers didn't die in hunting accidents, and where pandemics never occurred. As Brady imagined, a portal to that world opened in the form of a white iris in midair. He hadn't created that universe or timeline, he had merely dialed it up in his mind and opened the passageway. It was there nonetheless, just like the quantum law of fiction said it would be. All possible universes exist, therefore all imagined universes must also exist. He could see Holyoke Street in Brewer on a sunny day, with cars driving by and people walking on the street. His house was clearly in view, and there was his dad's truck in the yard. "This is one of the worlds where Dad didn't die," Brady explained. Grendel, who was his spitting image from 2 years ago, said, "Thanks, Brady, thank you." The younger child turned and gave Brady a hug. "No problem, buddy. Go on now. Give them both a big hug, and remember, be good. Read a lot of books. Remember to imagine." Grendel stepped towards the round portal and then started running. He slipped through the portal, shouting, "Hey, Mom! Hey, Dad!" The portal closed just as his mother and father stepped out onto the porch and waved to their boy as he ran to them from the distance. The iris of the portal closed. Brady stared at it a very long time as a different life passed before his eyes, the life he might have lived if things hadn't turned out as they had, of a father who would be there when he graduated first from high school and then college. He imagined meeting a certain blue-eyed, raven-haired girl a little older than himself, maybe finding true love, adventure, a future, a new family. He imagined everyone alive again in this other world, and then he imagined himself away from this place, out into his own reality. "Not so easy to get rid of us, though." Brady heard the voices gurgling and struggling for breath, like ancient athletes nearing the end of their marathon. "We made a bargain with him," the voices of the remaining Keres whined. "You made a bargain with him, and I'm his lawyer, so sue me." The voices began to gasp for breath and complain more vociferously. Ghostly forms began to emerge in the air before him and grab for him like swimmers on the edge of some high embankment hoping for rescue. "The world can do without you," said Brady. They screamed their angst and rebelliously tried to push against Brady with their incorporeal forms, but in this place he was bedrock and they were a whisper on the wind. He knew they were trying to somehow merge and bond with him as they had done with the monster, desperately seeking to continue their existence. They'd survived for millennia alongside humans, infecting them, driving them to commit heinous and unforgivable actions and crimes. They fed upon human weakness, fear, and longing. They swirled around him in a perverse ballet, but Brady stood quietly and waited for them to wear themselves out. And then he heard her voice. "Pitiful, aren't they?" she asked, half laughing. It was the voice of the hag, the one who refused to bond with Grendel in the first place. "Totally," Brady agreed, unsure of her particular evil. "I'll take them, with your permission, Renamer," she stated simply. "What would you do with them?" "I'll punish them for their desertion." "Who are you?" Brady asked. "I've been called by many names over the centuries," answered the hag. "I keep my name and share it with no one." "Well, why do you care about them?" he asked. "Care? I don't care. I hate them. But no more than I hate most humans. Besides, I will need them in the distant and not-so-distant future." "Well, I can't just let you take them," he answered. "One of them might be cancer. Another one of them might be envy or war, even ignorance. I mean, the people of the world are so few now. We need a break from those things." "Let them fade away and die," was Brady's response. The hag cackled and coughed a long while before she responded. Brady wasn't sure if she was amused or angry. "I'll make you a deal, Renamer. For all time, you and your descendants will have power over the Keres. We will respond to your commands, do as you say. We will infect who we wish, trouble people with all manner of afflictions and trials, but in the end, if you command it, we will leave those alone whom you signify. You will see that we are as much a part of being human as love and kindness and joy. Do not try to rid the world of those of us who remain. Many of us perished by the monster's greed, but no world with any good in it can pretend that evil and darkness don't exist. You can't have the light without the dark. There are other powers out in the wide world now that you don't even know of that are far, far worse than us. You are not the only one with newfound powers. Others will task you. We could be of assistance. We can help you." Brady asked, "How can I trust that you'll keep your word?" The hag laughed again. "You can't. There are so few of you left. It's a gamble." The weakened Karis struggled against the tide and threatened to drown them in nothingness, less and less visible each passing second. "I agree to your terms," replied Brady. The forms immediately screamed in agony and began to implode upon themselves into tiny singularities. One by one, they began to form small black dots that swirled around Brady's head, little evil Tinkerbells. Then they converged, and like a dying ember, they simply went out. "It's a bargain, Renamer. I will be your intermediary. Simply summon me by calling my name when you wish. I will answer." "Your name? What is it?" "For now, call me what he called me. The hag," were her final fading words. In the world outside, the general found himself watching Grendel's face again began to shift and turn, morphing from one form into another, from animal to human and back again. There were faces too deformed and ugly to even glimpse for a moment without pain. The general hoped to see one face in particular, but it wasn't forthcoming. 10,000 faces came and went with ever-increasing frequency as the monster's body began to thrash and twist. It was somehow shrinking into itself, imploding rather than exploding. Quivering with convulsive fury, Grendel began to change back into his original form and then shrank until further and further he was nothing more than a singularity, a point in space, and then he was gone. When the general saw the truth of it, he gently sheathed his sword. He had successfully held the monster off, but he was already beginning to feel his bronze begin to stiffen and crack. He needed rest desperately. Gregoire was licking his hands like a dog as he squatted on a stone on the river bank, swearing a blue streak beneath his breath. He had fought valiantly as well. Time began to flow again. Lights flashed. The earth formed and settled into shape. Brady was no longer in the monster. He was back in observation mode. Brady took his bearings. There was the bridge above him, the lights were on, and electricity was flowing. He was lying on the riverbank, soaking wet and cold. Walking up to him slowly was the form of General Joshua Chamberlain. Brady wondered if he would ever be able to successfully convey the truth of what had happened inside of his own mind to his friends. The only thing he knew was that a small boy had somehow made it out of the mind of the monster to a place where everything was as it should be. In all the years to come, through all the battles and miles, the knowledge that his younger self was happily living the good life in another place would give him the strength to go on. Kaylee had named him a man, but somewhere inside there was still a boy. There always is, he thought, even in the oldest warrior. Brady looked for Kaylee. She was still standing on the water at the very edge of the river, but she was also somewhere else, frozen still, eyes staring straight ahead. He ran down to her and waded toward her, taking her hand. 1,000 cannons fired. The world exploded. Sound took on a new dimension as the power that had been flowing through Kaylee and into the bridge suddenly changed its pathway and coursed through their bodies. The impact threw Brady and Kaylee through the air and back against the far bank of the river. When he regained consciousness a moment later, he saw the form of Bjorn pulling her body from the water and back to the shore. End of chapter.